Hi, everyone. Okay, so we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. So the president of our student committee is on the call as well, and she just wanted to say hi. So I just wanted to thank you all for joining us in this student committee webinar hosted by myself, secretary of the student committee. My name's Stephanie, and I'm a fourth year PhD student at UJ, and I just wanted to give you guys a couple of tips on some conference presentation strategies that I think might help you guys out a lot. Some things that I've picked up just over the years, I've heard from my advisor, from just attending conferences, from my peers, and I hope that this will be an instructive experience for all of you. So I think that one of the important things that we tend to neglect is presenting our information in a way that's going to be accessible to our audiences. I think we all tend to put a lot of work, sometimes years, into the things that we end up presenting in just a mere 10, 12 minutes. We put a lot of work on the front end. We, apply to grants, spend countless hours in the lab, or just like hosting studies and things like that. And then once we get up there, we want to make sure that all of that work kind of is true, and that other people can also grasp how important and meaningful and interesting our work is. And so this is just a way to kind of gloss it up a little bit once you've already put in all the bulk of the work at the beginning. Okay. Hopefully this will also help with people becoming interested in coming up to you and talking to you after the presentation is maybe approaching you somewhere, at the cocktail hour or something like that. So you want to make sure that people are leaving your talk with like some straight takeaways, things that they definitely grasped from your. And I think that this will have a lot of relevance, not just for conference presentations, but maybe even just tips for if you're giving a brown bag, or talking at colloquium, or giving a talk to your department or anything like that. I think that a lot of these will translate pretty well to these other kinds of settings as well. So let's get started. All right, so first I just wanted to give a brief overview of, we all know kind of the general pattern, right? You start off your talk with giving some background on your topic of interest. And so I just wanted to say that for this part, you want to focus on the big picture. I know that, like I was mentioning just now, you've probably spent years mulling over all the literature, the nuances of, the thing that you're going up there and only have 10 minutes to talk about. And so there's probably a lot that you want to say and that you want to share, and you want to, be a good scientist and present the topic, the background from every angle possible. But there's just not going to be enough time for that. And your audience is not going to be as familiar with what you're talking about. And so they're not going to be as interested as you are, even though you might think this is the most interesting thing ever, this like one small detail about, one random study. Your audiences are not going to be there for that. They're going to be for your talk. So you want to make sure that you're always focusing on the big picture. And that feeds well into this. So you want to spoon feed your audience, and know, like, this doesn't mean, treating them like they're, not knowledgeable about what you're talking about. It's more about, when you focus on the big picture, this means that you are giving create simple statements that feed into each other. So each of your slides should kind of flow from the last one and should be setting it all up so that when you get to the point where you present your methodology, your audience is thinking, well, of course, that's the next logical step for why, for where to take this research avenue. And when you present your research, they have the question in mind, the research question that you've proposed and that you've been kind of hammering in this entire time. They'll have that readily available. And so when you present again, they'll be thinking, yes, this makes sense right now that I would be receiving this information at this point in time. So you always want to start off your talk thinking about the takeaways, the main take home message that you want your audience to leave there with, and kind of frame your entire talk around that main message so that your audience is with you and following you the entire time and not wondering, well, why are they mentioning this now? Why are they presenting that result? Okay, so you want to pose a question, then present your study or series of studies, and then answer that question. It's a very simple, almost skeletal recipe, but it definitely works. And then a little bit more concrete advice is sticking to 3 or 4 bullet points per slide. And I don't mean like full sentences, full run-on 50-word sentences. I do mean, a couple of words, kind of like what you're seeing on this screen here. The bullet points are really there for 2 reasons. The first one I would say is the most obvious. It's to cue you. So you will read these 4 or 5 words you've given yourself, and you should have your own thoughts about what you're going to say just based off of those 3 or 4 words, or 6 words. And so the second purpose I would say is that your audience can look at it, and then also just kind of, know like as you're talking, oh, okay, this is like the main that they're making right now. So again, this shouldn't be that difficult to stick to just 3 or 4 bullet points per slide. If you are really focusing on the big picture, you won't have copious amounts of information. I feel that that is one of the biggest things that I see that's kind of a no-no in presentations, just having like paragraphs of words, even if you don't read them all out loud or read straight from the slide. It's just too busy for your audiences to really keep up with that much information. Remember, they're not just there listening to your 12-minute talk, they're also listening to multiple other talks. So you want to distill it to the most important information. So to that end, you definitely want to avoid complete sentences. You can use telegraphic speech, probably one of the only times that's okay. And you want to stick to this kind of general rule of allotting around 1 minute per slide. I'm probably not doing that right now, but I also have an hour to talk and not 12 minutes. So you want to make sure that the content on each slide keeps moving, so that you're only really sticking around for 1 minute. If you're spending 5 minutes on a slide, that's probably going to be a problem as you reach, your last few slides, and then you start realizing, oh my gosh, I only have 2 minutes left, and now I have to like rush through 10 slides, which are inevitably going to be some of the most important slides because they'll contain your results. So this is an example from one of the Outstanding Student Paper Award winners. This is an example of an introductory slide that I thought was quite good. So clearly this presenter wanted to talk about some sort of issue relating to policing, and they have this nice little hook, which is always a great thing to have. So they bring in a real world document, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, to hopefully frame the importance of what it is that they're going to be discussing on that day. So I'm sure that, for us at APLS, this is not that difficult to do. A lot of, I would say the majority of all the work that all of us do has very immediately clear applications, or at least the reasons for doing that work are very clear. But I think that sometimes it's nice to be able to like very quickly, you don't have to spend 5 minutes like talking about the report, but just kind of giving a little bit of background information for your audiences to kind of know where you're coming from, and to also get excited about your work and realizing why it's important that you're here presenting this information for them. This is an example from one of my own patients. So this was the very first slide after the title slide, of course. For one of my talks, I research alibis, and so I just wanted to very quickly give, um, very short, like 5 word, 2 sentence total recap of some of the issues that these individuals had with generating their own alibis. And some of these faces are going to be, recognizable to audiences. So again, trying to like make it very relevant for people, talking very briefly about Stephen Avery from Making a Murder, Adnan Syed. These are things that are kind of in our, consciousness right now or in popular media. So trying to bring in real world things is always helpful. And notice how I didn't necessarily write Stephen Avery and then write like his a little spiel about the story or from Making a Murder or anything like that. Just having their faces is enough because you're there for a reason. Otherwise, you would just send your slides out to everyone. The reason you're there is to tell a story, and you can verbalize all those things. You don't necessarily have to rely on bullet points for everything. Whenever possible, I would say it's best to replace words, even if it's just a few words, with images. Again, nobody's necessarily interested in the individual's names. It's more about the relevance of their stories and what happened to them for your research that is important. So this is another example of what just kind of showcasing what I was talking about with having short bullet points kind of say the story, the point you're trying to make, right? So in my presentation, this is another example from my presentation. I was talking about how alibis can be really bad for you, especially because inconsistencies make people look guilty. Obviously, I had more to say about that than just those like 5 lines. Um, so I also discuss, for example, other types of research showing, oh, if you come up with an alibi, not because of a memory error, but because, I don't know, you were engaging in some sort of salacious activity, then you're going to look guilty. So my point is, I'm saying all of these other things that have been found in other research, but I'm not necessarily putting bullet points all about that because I've distilled all of that information into just this key component. That is the takeaway I want people to remember. And same for these other points here. Okay. I think of slides as being primarily a visual aid for yourself, but also for mostly for your audiences, of course. So one good thing about a visual aid, unsurprisingly, is that it is clearly something that people can actually see, right? So you want to avoid tiny, tiny fonts. This is like very concrete advice here. 20 size font is what I've heard is kind of really the bare minimum in terms of size. You always want to go higher than that. 20 is, you should definitely be avoiding that in any slides um, uh, towards the beginning, like your literature review, your methods maybe might have that, but it should be used very, very sparingly. Um, Size 24, it's a little better. I know you guys are probably thinking you're seeing this on your computer. Your computer's like a foot away from your face or something, and you're thinking, what is she talking about? This doesn't look that bad. But the reality is that when you're in a room where you're 20 feet away, and maybe the projector bulb is not at, it's seen better days, and there's all types of other things going on. Maybe somebody really tall is sitting in front of you. You're going to want your audiences to be able to see what you have displayed there, and some of these fonts are just not going to cut it. So 32, now we're getting places. Seriously, 32 is really, really good. That's what you should have throughout most of your presentation. 44 is really large and should probably be reserved only for headers. This is another tip that I feel like I've just kind of recently discovered. It's the use of widescreen slides. So that's what you guys are seeing today. Typically, if you don't set your slideshow to widescreen, it kind of starts off, I'm going to show you, it's off like over here, ends over here. It's just it's like a little square. And so that's just not going to allow you to have as much space to insert images or insert the very, very minor text that I mentioned you should be inserting. I just also want to stop for a moment and just say that if you guys have any very specific questions, or not just specific questions, you can have broad questions as well. Definitely feel free to type them in, and I can try to answer those as we go along as well. Right, some more concrete advice. You want to have eye-catching color contrasts. So this is very boring probably, but having uh, black font on a white background or white font on a black background, as I'm showing you here, is also going to be very effective. You can obviously also have other types of combinations. You just have to be a little more careful about those because dark colors on black, for example, do not work very well. And I don't have an example of this, but very light colors do not work well on white backgrounds either. So you might be thinking, I don't want to have a boring, typical conference presentation slideshow. I want to show a little bit of my personality in my slideshow, but you don't want to go too overboard with that because the goal is ultimately for people to be able to see what you're displaying up there. And this goes without saying, but you should also avoid difficult to read fonts. I know that some labs have like very specific fonts that your advisor might be saying that you should be using. I think that you can use whatever font you want as long as it is legible and it's not getting a little too wild and crazy, and making it difficult for no reason for people to look at it. So for example, the font I'm using here is Kendara. All right, special effects, transitions, and animations. So that was an example of one. I would say that that was unnecessary, but I just wanted to show you what I meant by that. Transitions and animations can sometimes help guide people's attention, and they can also help you if you want to emphasize a major point. You'll notice the way that I primarily use animations. It's what I've been doing during this slideshow, which is this, just having each bullet point show up one by one. And that's what I mean by helping to guide people's attention. Because if you have all of the information just kind of displayed all at once, you might find that some audience members will, not just some, I think any human being looking at a slide that's got all this text, especially if you're not inundating it with a bunch of text, their eyes are just going to naturally gravitate to other parts of the slide that you might not want them to get to just yet, especially if you're using 4 words to cue yourself to a longer thing that you want to say. You don't want to lose them. You want to make sure that they're always there with you. um, uh, Otherwise, then what's kind of the point of you being there if they're just going to be reading your slides directly? That you could have just sent them your slides and not come to the presentation, right? So definitely use transitions and animations sparingly because if overused, they can distract and definitely be very annoying and flashy, as that one that I just used definitely was. So definitely try to avoid that. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about by transitions and animations, you can definitely Google this, how to do it. It's extremely simple if you don't know, but you just go to PowerPoint and you go to the animations, part, and you can look at the little animation pane here that I've included. You can mess around with these kinds of settings, and figure what works best for your presentation. Alternatively, you might consider using a laser pointer. So if you have, like, for example, diagrams or charts or bar graphs or things like that that you want to point to specific parts of, um, a laser pointer is probably better than having, the text enlarged via an animation or something like that. It'll look a lot less tacky and flashy. So investing in one of these might be a good idea. Another example of an animation I would not suggest using. Right. This is another big one. So you want to try to avoid um, wherever you can replace words, especially like if you're talking about specific procedures in your methodology or things like that. Anywhere you can replace these words with diagrams and flowcharts and images is going to be really, really great. And again, keep your audience interested in what you're showing them. So this is an example of a slide from one of my presentations where the methodology was a little bit complicated. It is 5 different phases to this paradigm. And I knew that if I put this up, this is very busy. If I put this up immediately and I just started talking from phase 1, there's just no way that my audience is going to ignore phases 2 through 5. There's a lot of text there. There's a lot of information that is just, going to have them wondering, well, what's going to be there? What does that mean? Why is all that up there? You should just probably hide that kind of thing away until the relevant time comes. So this is an example of also, even just for like phase 1, for example, having minimal kinds of information. In this in this slide, for example, I wanted to talk about how I had participants tell us, the types of typical activities they would normally be engaged in for every hour of the day. We specifically asked them to report who they thought they would be with, they thought they would be, what they thought they would be doing. But you see, I don't write all of that out. I just have a, who, where, what, and distilling the information that way is just going to also help people store that information a little better, process a little better as well. And then some of these things are kind of just like for just to give your audience an idea of what the study experience was for the participants. So in my study, I texted participants these same questions at a different time point. So then I just took a screenshot of a text message response that of course, this is not actual participant data. This was a fake one that I made up, but it's basically what it looked like for participants, well, at least those who had an iPhone. And so my audience could have, an idea of what that part looked like. But that's really extra. That's not totally necessary. I think we all know what a text message looks like. This is another example from another student presentation award winner who I thought did a really great job also replacing words with images. So in this example, they were trying to inform their audience of specific cases of exonerees who had displayed what were probably perceived as being the wrong emotions by law enforcement. And so, she put up, I think this is Jeffrey Deskovich, and how, police probably interpreted his emotions at the time of, the 911 call as being overly distraught, or Amanda Knox, who was seen as being inappropriate. So again, just showing these photos, not necessarily having to write who it is or give case information, will get the point across. This is another example from one of my slideshows where, again, I was telling people how to, memories are stored, the event happens, you encode it, store it, you retrieve it, yada, yada. And then I wanted to point out how alibi memories are typically made up of kind of boring routine events. So then I put up photos of boring routine events like brushing your teeth, taking a shower in the morning, going to work, going about your daily routine. You also want to make sure, though, if you have photos and things like this, that they do pop up as you are talking about them. I realize that did not just happen for me, but you do want to make sure that, the images are kind of coming up as you're saying them, which can take a little bit of practice. And if you're not comfortable with that, then you can also just slap the images up there, and that'll get the point across as well. All right. So one of the bigger things that I think is just going to be one of those broad pieces of tips that are going to be very helpful, very well demonstrated in this PhD comics. So person saying, "Are you ready for your talk?" And you might be like, "Yes, I've got my laser pointer per Stephanie's suggestion. I've got my awesome slides. I've backed up all of my presentation in every which way possible." But at the end of the day, are you truly ready to give your presentation? Well, the way to make sure that you are truly ready and truly confident is not just like having pretty slides or slides that are going to be, present the information in a way that's digestible to your audience. You just can't get around actually having like practicing giving your talk over and over and over again. You should aim to have a full draft around 2 weeks before your talk. So, for example, I guess people are mostly presenting March, what is APL's 4th, 4th, 5th, 6th. So you want to have a draft ready probably within the next week or something like that. Just so it doesn't have to be, the final product by any means, but just something that you feel comfortable doing a whole run through of. So you might do a run through in front of an advisor, maybe your lab, your department, your dog, your hamster, literally anyone. You can record yourself and just like do it in front of yourself, in front of the mirror. It might make you uncomfortable, but I promise that this is honestly the most helpful thing that you can possibly do. It'll help you. You might think that, I've been researching this for 2 years. I know this backwards and forwards. There's just nothing, there's no way that I can't go up there and just like talk about my thing without having to rehearse it 10 times. But the truth of the matter is that practicing will help you get more comfortable with your own slides, will help you get more comfortable with presenting in front of audiences, which is a very difficult and unique skill set on its own. But also, it'll help you get the timing right, which is one of the bigger things that you're going to struggle with if you've not practiced. It's not easy doing a talk in exactly 12 minutes, but once you start practicing, you'll start noticing, oh, okay, the first time I did it, it was 25 minutes. Or if you're me, like 45 minutes. And you're like, okay, that's definitely not going to work. I'm going to get booed off the stage. I need to cut, this, and this, and I need to maybe not, you know, deliberate on this one bullet point for 5 minutes, and so on. So exposure and repetition are key. But with that being said, and I'm going to contradict a little bit here, or so it's going to seem, you definitely don't want to overdo the repetition. Because at some point, if you repeat too much, it starts sounding a little scripted. So I'll give you an example. For my first presentation, I probably rehearsed it in front of my lab, again, and then in front of the department, and then I recorded myself. And then at one point, I remember I was like, I have this recording. I'm gonna go on a run. Maybe I can like do it, and then that way I'll know I'm ready. That yes, that's way too much. um, and so the reason for that is you don't want to go up there and sound like a robot. You don't want to sound like you have the script kind of memorized, but not just because you don't want to sound that way, because you're gonna potentially have kind of a like monotone, drony voice if you're reading a script either directly from your slide presentation notes or from your memory. But the bigger issue, honestly, is that if you forget any part of your script, you're going to stumble because you're just going to be stuck on the fact that you forgot something, or if you forget something and then you kind of know the next line after the thing you forgot, but you're stuck on the thing that you did forget, and it's going to be silent and you're going to feel uncomfortable. And it just shouldn't be that kind of you shouldn't have that kind of experience if you basically practice not with a script that involves full sentences, but rather bullet points, so that it's a little bit more conversational. And when you go up there, if you dissociate like I tended to at the beginning, I was definitely a very nervous, not a natural public speaker. Um, I felt like sometimes, if I dissociated a tiny bit, then it would just be me relying on the script. And if that script went away, then I would just kind of get stuck and be like, oh my gosh, I have forgotten how to speak. I have forgotten like what am I talking about? And so you want to avoid that kind of thing. And I think that nerves are going to play a lot into this. Another thing you might want to, I mentioned filming yourself, but another reason to do that is you might catch yourself having kind of like anxious tics, maybe like, I don't know, touching your nose or touching the side of your face or something like that. Maybe something you want to avoid in front of a talk so that you can kind of seem more confident and be more confident about what you're presenting. You might also find that you say a little too much. And so filming yourself can also help you realize that. I guess also talking in front of your department and your lab, your hamster will also, maybe not your hamster, but your advisor or something will let you know if you do say a little bit too much, or if you have these kinds of anxious tics. Right. So I think a lot of us have this idea in our heads of, the conference presentation, how it's going to go. And it looks a lot like this up here. So this is another comic from PhD Comics. And this is all great, right? Introduce yourself, describe, the outline of your talk, motivation, methodology, results, blah, blah, blah. But if you don't practice, it might end up looking a little bit like this. So there's two things about this bottom worst case scenario that I want to highlight. Some of it is unavoidable, something like previous speaker runs late and eats into your time, or technical difficulties connected to your laptop, connecting your laptop. So those kind of things might not be avoidable, but I'll talk a bit there about how you can kind of prepare for those types of things, because inevitably, um, we just don't know if that kind of thing will happen to you. So you have to be prepared regardless. It's not enjoyable, obviously, but you still have to be prepared. And so you want to, if you practice, you can avoid all of this, like spending way too much time talking about your bullet points and not enough. And then at the end, just kind of rushing through your results section. So when you present your methodology, this applies to everything that I've said so far, right? You can't go over it all. You can't go every nuanced aspect of your literature review and the like very specific minutia um, of the like theoretical construct that you're trying to examine. Just hit the major points, right? Same will go for the methodology. You want to present the parts that are relevant in enough detail that your audience members aren't going to be left wondering, well, how are they possibly getting these results from what they just described? But also, for example, if you've run a study that had a million components to it and for which you got a lot of data from, and you know you're not going to have time to present all of the results, then you can gloss over a little bit the part of the methodology that just, from which those results would have come from. You can just say, for example, oh, and we did this, but we won't talk about it today because you just don't have time. So for symposiums in particular, also I would recommend just kind of coordinating with the other speakers to make sure that if you guys are covering the same methodology, if you're looking at different parts of a similar like 5-phase study, for example, or if, for example, in the study that I was describing, for the alibis that I did, I had part of it was I recorded participants actually giving their alibi statements. If I were then to have, one of my colleagues were to give another talk immediately where they just talk about a study they ran using those videos, they would not have to go over the entire method of how they collected the videos. And that's obviously a more obvious example, but there are, less obvious examples where you might also still be able to cut a little bit of the methodology, not have to explain the same scale again, how it works. Or obviously this applies as well to literature reviews. So if you're going to do a symposium on plea bargaining or something like that, not everybody has to start, spend a couple of slides talking about how 97% of cases are resolved through plea bargains in our criminal system. Because at that point, I think your audience will kind of get it. With that being said, though, there are people who kind of just come in just to listen to your talk or just to listen to someone else's talk and then, leave the room to go listen to another talk somewhere else. So maybe they weren't there necessarily to hear the methodology in full presented by your colleague just before. So it's kind of a balancing act. It's up to you, you have to make a judgment call about whether, how much information is actually necessary. It's not like you're going to cease to exist at the end of your presentation and there's no way possible that your audience member will have access to this information. They can definitely, ask you either during the Q&A or come see you afterwards or email you or something like that. So this is an example from one of the Outstanding Student Paper Awards that I thought pretty demonstrated their methodology, a little bit, some aspects of their participants pretty well. It's nice, neat, clean. All right. So you also want to not this part where you're presenting your results. It's kind of the whole point of why everyone's come to listen to your talk. And so you unfortunately, because it comes after you've done the whole lit review yourself, not in that order, hopefully, done the methodology. At this point, start feeling rushed, like, oh my gosh, I only have 2 minutes left, I only have 5 minutes left, and they might feel to rush through this, but this is the whole point of why people came here. And so you want to make sure you allot sufficient time for this. You want to remind your audience of the research question before presenting the results as well. So you kind of, again, put it into context for them. And again, this is following the same idea of spoon feeding the information to your audience. You want to make sure that they're with you. You should prioritize broad findings over, tiny little details about the statistical analysis that you just ran. Maybe you for this study, you didn't do your typical ANOVA or something, and so you ran some really complicated, I don't know, like multiple parallel mediation analysis with like, I don't know, on R or something crazy like that. And then feel compelled to, sit there and like explain to your audience like every aspect of that. But you've structured your entire talk around the takeaways. And the takeaway is not the statistical that you used, unless it is. If that's the point of your talk, then that's different. But it most likely won't be. So you don't need to, and you don't have to belabor this point. If they have more questions, they can ask you afterwards. Always make sure to explain graphs, tables, and charts. If you can just show a slide with a graph and say, look, it supported our hypotheses, that's not going to be enough. You should be explaining, like, oh, if you look here on the y-axis, these like percentage points, they indicate this, and just kind of really demonstrate to your audience, what each part of the graph means. Maybe have it appear in sections so that, again, it's not an overwhelming amount of information that they're just suddenly bombarded with. And you want to include a results summary slide, right? So this right after your results, where you just, again, this is like really the super straight takeaways. You just want to have a couple of bullet points where you say, we found this, or they can be framed as the discussion points that directly come from your results. After you've maybe talked a lot about, the differences in means here or this, in a very complicated way, you can, again, distill that information, put it into different words for your audience. So this is an example of what I was saying of presenting the research right before the results again. So here I have, for my alibi study, I reminded the audience that what I was interested in was whether the type of schema and questioning technique would influence alibi memory accuracy. And then I presented on the next slide this bar graph. And you'll notice this is somewhat contested, I guess, including this amount of information. I am of the opinion that as long as it's in a relatively small font, so that only the people who look at that kind of information can look at it, but it's not the whole point of and it's not distracting people from looking at the parts of the slide that you want them to be focusing. And again, this is, again, super telegraphic, right? Just highlighting another point in as few words as possible. So but yeah, here you would probably say, on this axis we see total accuracy on a scale of 0. You think that that's maybe obvious, but you'd be surprised. You should always try to explain it in detail. This is an example from another 2018 Outstanding Student Paper Award winner that I thought presented their correlation results in a way that was pretty easily digestible for their audience members. And, they could have just put 3 bullet points and they didn't. Right. So you want to wrap up your presentation by giving the takeaways, talking about your limitations, future directions, all again in a few points. So this is an example of a discussion from another award winner where it's just a couple of sentences and, each one has a point that is very succinctly made. And here is winner who I thought did a really great job discussing the implications, limitations, and future direction. Rather, presumably they discussed it really well as well, but the slides also present that information very concisely. So these are the technical issues I discussed before, right? They're unavoidable for the most part, but there is a little bit that can be done to at least limit the probability that this will happen to you. And I would say that one of the biggest ones is, if possible, inspect the presentation room beforehand. You want to ensure that if you can get there 5-10 minutes before, great. If you can get there the day before, even better. You want to make sure that your projector is working. There's not a weird green tint on the projector, which has definitely happened to me. That the equipment that you need or feel that you need is available to you, that your slides are compatible with whatever version of the computer they have there. These are all things that you can check beforehand. And so you're not surprised by just like inserting your USB immediately before your talk or something like that. Yeah, so if you want to ensure that something like a clicker is there, if that's what you've been practicing with and feel comfortable using, and make sure that your slides did not undergo some terrible transformation from your computer to uh, whatever potentially old or outdated version of a computer they might have at the conference location, right? One thing you can do is bring a backup PDF just in case all else fails. You have a PDF of your slides. I saw this advice in an article that I will share at the end in the references, where it said it might be a good idea to have overhead transparencies. So no, I think PDFs are the way to go. Clearly, this article is a little bit outdated, but PDFs are going to be your friend. Right, presentation etiquette. So this is kind of the final portion of today's webinar. I got a lot of these. I want to give a shout out to the Twitter feed. I have this, I think, at the end, and if not, I have it in the notes that I can share with you guys. But there was a Twitter feed that just kind of went through all these presentation etiquette rules that someone came up with that I thought were just so perfect that I thought I'd adapt them a little bit for this webinar. And the first rule that this person said was to respect your audience, and it's so true. They've paid a lot of money, as have you, presumably, to be here at this conference, and so you should. You're not an entertainer, of course, but you should at least strive to, think about how your presentation is coming across to them, and make sure that everyone's getting what they came for. So one of the first things you want to do is know your time allotment, right? So 1 slide per minute rule. Don't make 30 slides if you know you're going to be talking for 12 minutes. You want to engage your audience. A lot of the tips that I've given so far will help with that, but also just, not reading directly off your slides and like looking, making eye contact, walking around a little bit. Maybe if you can somehow integrate asking questions of your audience, that'll help as well. Leaving time for questions is a big one that I feel that most people don't do. I know there's some debate about, should we leave the questions for the end after all the presenters have spoken, or do it immediately after? I think that, in my opinion, it's best to do it immediately after, because otherwise, um, audience members might either rethink their question, decide it's not worth asking, forget it, lose interest in asking their own question, or just not have enough time at the end. So I think it's just best, if you want to get feedback, and you should want to hear what other people think as well. It's the whole reason of presenting work and disseminating results of your study. You should leave at least 2 minutes for other people to ask you things. Definitely don't read off the slides. Don't need to belabor that point. And build your talk around your takeaway, which I've mentioned before, and use the mic. If there's not a mic, hopefully someone can request one. You can request one, but using the mic is very important for several reasons, one of which I'm going to discuss in the next slide. And end on time. For Pete's sake, end on time. Because when you don't end on time, then the next person has less time, and then they have to make decisions about cutting things from their slides, or they don't make that decision, and then it throws the entire schedule off, and the last person really gets the short end of that stick. So there were some really neat APA accessibility guidelines from the APA website that I found that I think people should really be aware of. And they're pretty straightforward, honestly, and not difficult at all to integrate into your talk. So the point is to consider members in your audience who might have difficulty seeing or hearing, right? So to that end, you definitely want to use the mic, as I've now mentioned 3 times. And if there's no mic, or even in addition to, repeating audience questions is really helpful. So, if someone asks something and they kind of like mumble it and you kind of grasp it, don't just start answering the question, because odds are that at least one person did not hear the question, probably many than one person. So you want to say, did everyone hear that? Or just restate the question. And all visuals as well. This kind of goes hand in hand with describing the graphs as well. So you want to say, this graph rates, and avoid just saying, if you look here, you can see on this graph that my hypothesis was correct. Right. Rule number 2 is respecting your co-presenters. A lot of the rules for respecting your audience apply here, so I'm not going to repeat those. Things like not going on over time, but some of these are more applicable to symposiums. So you might want to finish your slides ahead of the conference and distribute to the other in order to remove repetitive information. And consider sending your discussant thoughtful questions about your talk. Obviously, you want to make that task as easy for them, and help also frame your talk from your own perspective. And ending on time. Again, if you're the chair, especially of a symposium, you want to that the other that everyone is finishing on time. And I know it's really awkward, but it's everyone's going to give a sigh of relief. Right. Probably one of the most important things is being enthusiastic about your talk. So I like this. I included this comic because it shows, their science project did not work out, but that is science at the end of the day. And just because your results maybe didn't pan out doesn't mean that you should go up there and kind of be like down and stuff, or regardless. And maybe if you're nervous, just remember to smile, remember to laugh. I feel like this is what I'm trying to work on. Like I've said, I've recorded myself giving talks, and I feel like I come across a lot more serious than I actually am. But it's just kind of the nerves, right, of being up there. So you want to remember to smile, laugh, arms around a little bit, walk around and away from the podium. This can be very difficult for beginners. Again, it makes your talk seem more dynamic and engages your audience a lot more when you can walk around a bit. And you want to, at the end of the day, just project excitement over your own work, because this is also going to help other people get excited about your work as well. So fielding questions from the audience. All right, so this is an opportunity to further discuss and clarify your work. Questions can be either easy or totally unexpected. I feel like they generally fall into one of these two camps. And so the easy questions you don't really have to worry about. They're probably about your methodology or something really basic about why you made some choice that you did, and or some paper that you've probably read 100 times because it very closely relates to your work. You don't really have to worry about those. And you really don't have to worry about the totally unexpected questions either, because they're expected. So there's no way that you can truly prepare for them. So when that happens, when you don't have an answer because the question was unexpected, or if it was just straight up difficult, or you haven't looked into that in your data, fake it. Just, you don't have to act defensive. You can just be honest and restate why it's an question for the audience. Say, hey, I had not thought about it from that perspective, but maybe, and then speculate actively about, empirical reason for why you might expect a certain result based off of whatever point that the audience member has made, or whatever scenario they've given you. You can just kind of like actively speculate and maybe engage in some sort of conversation. Maybe they'll want to talk to you a little bit more about it afterwards, and you can connect to them. Right. Other miscellaneous suggestions: if you get nervous, as we all tend to do, you can take a pause, drink some water, and just collect yourself. It's normal. Focus on a friendly face. This is something you can preemptively do. So have, if your advisor or not your advisor, just a friend or colleague, someone who's going to be supportive and that you can look at in the audience. I know that during my first talk, I had my entire cohort, my advisor, and I felt very lucky to be supported that way. And I can acknowledge that it was very nice being able to look at them in the audience, see like, them nodding along, and just being generally supportive. It's very helpful. You might want to have also some detailed backup slides at the end. So, things, regarding your manipulation checks or other supporting results or exclusion criteria, things that audience members might have a question about. I feel like this doesn't actually come up as often, but I think it's because people tend to use their entire 15 minutes. And so these kinds of specific questions aren't necessarily coming up as often. And if you're comfortable, I would say share your slides on either the Open Science Framework or some other kind of repository or website, anything, just so that other people have access. Only if you're comfortable, of course, sharing your results, but just so other people can take a look at it afterwards, and just be aware of what it is that you're getting on up to. Right, and my last slide is just a reminder that the student committee is hosting a presentation awards. Again, this year they are due February 20th. There's more info here. We've also sent out email information about this, and there are a couple of awards that people can apply to. And so just keep an eye out on that, and try to do something. You never know. right? These are just some helpful resources for you guys that you can look up. Some of the things that I talked about today in this webinar came from these sources. I just find them overall very helpful. All right, thank you. If anybody has any questions. I'm just gonna check the chat just in case. Oh, there are, yeah, great. So I can just stick around if anyone has questions. Go back to this. Um, Unfortunately, because I am screencasting, this looks a little funky. So I guess I can stop sharing now. So do I know if APLS will be hosting conference-wide OSF links for people to share their slides to? I think that I had suggested that we do this just because I've seen other conferences. SARMAC did this, and then also EAPL did this, and I thought it was very, very helpful to have just kind of a one-stop shop for everyone to slides. So I think we'll definitely look into implementing that. Yeah, and you also don't even have to have an Open Science Framework account in order to upload your slides to this. So it's pretty easy for people to get in on this as well. Sorry, I just see what is the hardest question I have ever gotten. I think the most difficult question I have received it wasn't even much of a question. It was someone telling me that the theoretical premise of my study was incorrect. um, and it also happened to be someone who had also told me this at another conference when I had presented like study one of the same alibi stuff. And I mean, luckily I was like, oh, are you referencing, this specific article? And they didn't know what article I was talking about. And that kind of killed that conversation. But I mean, I think that for the most part, people are going to be not out there to get you. They're going to ask questions that are probably reasonable. Any other questions? Yeah, you're welcome. All right. So if anybody has any questions, now is the time. Otherwise, I think we can wrap this up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I really appreciate you spending an hour listening to me talk about conference presentation strategies. All right. Have a good night.